Hello, my name is Allison Carmen, and welcome to my podcast, 10 Minutes to Less Suffering. And the name of today's podcast is Why Won't This Pandemic Just End? And I know so many of us are feeling this way. But I have to say, when I resist it, when I feel angry or annoyed that the pandemic hasn't ended, I find I start to feel a lot of pain. And I start to feel less hopeful, and I start to be thinking about the future more than being in the moment. And what I also saw this week is that I started to read the news a lot, and I had been so excited about the vaccine and all these new treatments. And then I started to read about all these variants, and it just kind of knocks the wind out of you. And I think it's because sometimes you feel so hopeful when you hear good news, and then when you hear bad news, it just knocks you off your feet, and it makes you feel despair. And this is a roller coaster ride that doesn't feel good. And I think it's going to exhaust us if we don't get a hold of a strong mindset. Because it seems at this point that getting back to normal and the pandemic ending is going to be a very bumpy road. It seems like we're going to have days where it feels like things are moving forward, and then there are going to be days when it feels like things are moving backwards. And I bet people are also feeling that in their own life as well. So how do we handle this? How do we find a mindset that allows us not to get too down about what's happening in the moment, that the pandemic hasn't ended? And how do we find a mindset that helps us stay elevated when we're hearing good news and bad news and hopeful news and painful news? Because we want to find a way that we could be stronger and resilient through this time. And then when the pandemic ends, we want to come out of it ready to take on whatever life brings our way. And the mindset that helps me the most is this idea of maybe. And I actually fell out of maybe for a couple of days because of the news. And it is such a painful way to live, to not believe in hope and possibility. And also it's very painful not to make the most of the moment that you're in. And it reminded me of this story that I actually put in the gift of maybe. And the story is about a king, and he was hunting with his favorite servant. And he couldn't cock his gun, so the servant helped him, and the gun went off and it blew the king's finger off. And he turned to the servant and started to yell, "You blew off my thumb." And the servant said, "Maybe this is good." And the king went out of his mind. He threw his favorite servant in jail. And a few weeks later, he went hunting again, this time alone. And while he was hunting, a bunch of cannibals caught him. And they were about to eat him, and then they noticed that he was missing his thumb, and they wouldn't eat anything that wasn't whole. So they let the king go. And the king was so elated, he was so happy, that all of a sudden he realized that losing his thumb saved his life. So he ran to the jail. He opened up the door and he apologized to the servant. He said, "I feel so awful. I threw you in jail, and actually losing my thumb saved my life. These cannibals were going to eat me, but then they decided not to because they don't eat things that are not whole." And the servant says, "Maybe it's good I was in jail." And then the king says to the servant, "How could it be good that you were in jail?" And the servant turns to the king and says, "Because if I was hunting with you today, maybe they would have eaten me." And I love that story because it always reminds us that we don't know. We don't know what things mean. We know how they make us feel in the moment. And yes, sometimes that could be very painful. But we don't know what it means for the next moment and the next day and the next month and the next year. And I'm not saying that everything that happens leads to better things in your life. But what I am saying is that when something happens in our life, if we're willing to be open to its lessons or maybe blessings, or figuring out a way to make the best of whatever happens, if we could hold this mindset of maybe, we are more likely to find joy, to find happiness, to find a new beginning, a new opportunity, or at least make the best of whatever life throws our way. So when I thought about the king's story, it just shifted me immediately. And I realized that when I'm reading the news that, well, that might be true today, but it might not be true tomorrow, or it might not be true in a moment. And We're always so worried that things are going to change for the worse, but because life is uncertain, things could change for the better too. And when we remember that, we live with so much more ease. We're not fooling ourselves. We're not saying that life is always going to be a bed of roses, but we're also choosing not to live in despair and doom and gloom, because we are recognizing that wonderful, fabulous things happen in life too, even during pandemics. And I had forgotten how horrible it feels not to live in maybe. And yes, if you're a positive thinker, you don't have this problem, because positive thinkers do not budge when bad things happen. But most of us are afraid of the unknown. So when something bad happens in the moment, or we don't want to lose something, we project our fears into the future and we worry that things will never get better. And that relief I felt in my heart the minute I remembered maybe, I felt hope again. And I realized that this is true for the moment, but it doesn't mean it's true forever. And it's tough sometimes when you're going through it. And this pandemic is very challenging, especially because we've been doing it for 11 months and everybody thought that things were just going to start to clear up, and then the vaccines aren't rolling out the right way, and so many things that we can get stuck on. But if we get stuck, we're going to be miserable. If we get stuck, we're going to make ourselves sick. If we get stuck, we're going to stop creating things in our lives. And every day is going to be a struggle to get through. So that story is always a great reminder. If you think about it, you could always say, well, maybe this is good. But sometimes that's not the exact maybe statement that you want to use. And because I fell out of maybe for a couple of days, I thought of the king story, but I did the maybe practice several times a day, and it just works. You write your biggest fear down. And I know my fear was this pandemic is never going to end and things are never going to get better. And I just felt overwhelmed. But then I asked myself, Allison, are you absolutely certain that fear is true? And we can't be certain. We can't be certain because the future is unknown. When the pandemic first started, there was no vaccine. And then they said the vaccines were only going to be 50% effective. And now there are vaccines out there that are 95% effective. So even with all these new issues coming up, we can't know that we're doomed. We can't know that the pandemic will never end. So because we can't know, that means life has maybe. And we know when life is uncertain, good things can happen too. That is the most important thing to remember. Not knowing is a good thing. It has hope, it has possibilities, it has your dreams, it has the end of this pandemic. So when we remember that, we feel better. Our heart opens up and we enjoy the moment more, and we realize we have things to look forward to. So after I wrote that down, I started writing my maybe statements down. Maybe everything is okay. Maybe things will get better. Maybe I could accept everything that's happening. Maybe my thoughts are not true. And then I started to get more specific because I was thinking about the pandemic. Maybe the pandemic will end sooner than we think. Maybe they'll keep creating new vaccines and new treatments, and maybe different countries will start working together again. Maybe there'll be more peace. Maybe we'll save the environment. And hope just came right back in. And that's what maybe does. It opens a window. And hope has a place to come in, and it goes right into your heart. And I felt so much better. Because when I fell out of maybe, I was taking something that felt negative in the moment, and I was projecting it out for the rest of my life, for my children's lives, for everybody. And that's what we do. We have every reason to be hopeful. And we have every reason to think that we will find our way out of this. But it's so important to accept where we are in the moment. If we resist it, we're going to feel pain. And we still have our lives to live every day. We still have our family and our friends, and we have our work, and we have our potential, and we have new opportunities. So we have to accept the pandemic right now as part of our lives in order to feel good every day, in order to feel free every day. And at the same time, we have to embrace the unknown and realize that if we want our lives to change, it has to happen in the unknown. And good things happen in the unknown, and cures happen in the unknown, and new vaccines and new treatments. And hopefully a way that the world will open up again, and less people will be getting sick, and there's more potential for us to live the dreams that we have. So I hope you remember the king story And I hope you do the maybe practice. And also sometimes you could just have a maybe mantra. And one of the ones I used this week was, maybe things will get better. And I hope you always remember my favorite maybe statement of them all. Maybe the best is yet to come. Thank you for listening to this podcast today. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you could email me at allison@allisoncarmen.com. If you'd like to buy my book, The Gift of Maybe, it's available at all major bookstores and online retailers. And if you like this podcast, you could subscribe and leave a comment.